Hey, YouTube. Hope you're doing very, very well. Let me double check that this is actually working well and there's no issues with the connection or the sound. Hey, YouTube. Awesome. It is working. Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing very, very well. It's currently Tuesday evening, about 7:26 p.m. I'm sitting here in this very bright and yellow room. Check this out. Yellow room, yellow and green, very, very bright colors, very bright color choice. And I want to make a quick little video here, or rather a little bit of a longer video, and it's actually going to be a podcast. So for those of you who don't know, I have a podcast, and I podcast actually more frequently or a similar frequency as my YouTube videos. I probably do, I would say, 3 to 5 podcasts a week. And I thought I would pop this little camera on today and do a podcast on YouTube while I actually make the podcast for the podcast. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Excuse me. Check out the description below. In the description below, the video description, you're going to see a link to my podcast. By the way, hello, live viewers. Hope you're doing well. You're going to see a link to the podcast. I host my podcast on anchor.fm. So it's basically anchor.fm/polyglot-Azren. If you just search on iTunes or Overcast or any major podcasting platform, you will find my podcast. It is called The Language Learning Show. So you guys are more than welcome to go and check that out. With that aside, let's jump into today's podcast. I'm going to get my headphone in here so I can record it. Basically, today's podcast, it's about a language learning epiphany. I'll give you a quick little preview as I get my recording stuff ready here on my phone. I had a thought, would have been yesterday or maybe today. Yesterday or today I had a thought, and it's about viewing languages, both, let's call it laterally and vertically. Horizontally and vertically. I think there's a conversation to be had around that. And it's a thought that I've never had before. It's brand new. It's something it's something I've never ever thought about. And I thought it'd be worth making a podcast episode about. So let's get this thing set up on my phone here. So hang out for just a moment. I hope this connection's solid. Let me test this connection one more time. Make sure you guys can see and hear me okay. Yeah, it's not bad. It's not the best connection in the world, but it's definitely manageable, and you guys can hear me okay. Okay, we got this ready. I think I just heard someone open the door. Let me just see if someone's here. Just a moment. Nope, nobody's here. That was weird. Could have sworn I heard a door open. Apparently I didn't. All right. Okie dokie. So guys, check out the podcast. If you guys do not listen to it, I highly recommend you do. It's some really good stuff happening there. So here we go. Let's get this started. Okay. By the way, YouTube, type in any questions or any comments you have as I record this podcast. Feel free to do so. And I'll try to incorporate them into the podcast as we're going. Here we go. I'm a little nervous actually for some reason. It's a different dynamic having this YouTube open. Hello, hello, my fellow podcast people. I hope you're doing very, very well on this fine Tuesday evening, or whatever day and time it is for you right now as you're listening to this podcast episode. I'm your host, as per usual, Azren, the language nerd. You can find me primarily on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube, but also secondarily whenever I feel like posting on TikTok and on Tumblr. My username on all these platforms is exactly the same. It is at polyglot-Azren. That is spelled POLYGLOT-AZ or Z, depending on your country, REN. And welcome to another podcast episode. I'm very, very excited, as per usual, to be recording this one here. It's about 7:30 p.m. today on this fine Tuesday evening, and I just wrapped up all of my teaching and most of my work, let's say, for the day. I still have a couple things to get to. So for example, as per every Tuesday, I have a Gujarati class at 11 p.m. or rather 10 or 11. Usually we start somewhere between that time, depending on both my teacher schedule and what I'm doing around that time. And we start somewhere in there and we have a 1-hour class. And I want to actually pause on this moment. And I want to give a piece of advice for people who are taking private classes with a tutor or with a teacher. You need to be very assertive in your classes to make sure that you are using that time in the most effective way for you. So let me give you an example. Myself, when I'm going to my lessons, I am very direct and I'm very upfront with what I want to be doing in the classes and what I want to be getting out of the classes. So even like last week, I remember I was going to a class and I literally told my teacher, probably half an hour, 1 hour before the class, I told her, hey, let me be honest, I have not really done a lot of studying this week and I have not reviewed anything that we've learned. And I do not think that doing things that are new is going to be the most useful use of my time. Instead, what I would much rather do is I'd much rather you literally just hang out on Skype, because she lives in India. You literally just hang out on Skype. And what I'm going to do is I literally want to like sit there on Skype, review the things, review the notes, and send you, like text them to you or to, call you, quickly ask you all the questions and things that I have while I'm reviewing. And that's what we did. She's like, okay. So it felt weird. I mean, I'm sure it was unorthodox for the teacher, for me, for everyone. It was probably very unorthodox because obviously, usually when you pay for a class, you assume that you want the teacher's time versus what I told her is, can you just literally sit there and let me review stuff and ask you questions as I review. So I just wanted her to be available. And that's just what I needed. I knew that if the teacher's sitting there, that's going to make me actually study, which is going to be much more impactful than us actually having a traditional class between the two of us. Does that make sense? And so you've got to be very direct with your teacher. You've got to be strategic and use your time in the way that you think is going to work best for you. Now, I will say this. I understand that, some people, probably a lot of people even, I would even say the majority of language learners, they maybe don't have the language learning experience that I do. And so for myself, I'm usually pretty crystal clear on what I want to be working on, what would be most useful for me, what would help me, all of that good stuff. And so I do recognize that for people that maybe are not quite as experienced or quite as confident in knowing what they need for themselves, there's an argument to be made that maybe you should be letting your teacher guide the classes. But even for people, I'll be real with you, even for people that do not have, let's call it a lot of experience with language learning, as you're going in the classes, there will always be things that you feel like need more attention or that you'd like to change or that you'd like to focus on more. Always, no matter how fantastic or not fantastic the teacher is. One last example I'll give to kind of demonstrate this point. I'm working currently with two separate people. They're a couple, and I teach them Spanish. I remember it would have been roughly maybe a month, maybe 2 months, something like that. I don't remember anymore, but not that long ago. I was feeling like we were spinning our wheels in the classes, and I was feeling like we weren't moving forward as quickly or making as much progress as we probably should be. I felt like there was a disconnect. And it's ironic, it's actually a funny coincidence because the day that I brought that conversation up was the exact day that they also wanted to bring the conversation up. And it was fantastic to have that discussion around it to figure out like what are the things that you're wanting to focus on that we're not focusing on. Like there's certain elements that are not working here, and let's figure out why they're not working so that the money you're spending is actually money well spent. Does that make sense? And so that's something in those private classes that is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important. Now, that's just a random side note that I wanted to mention. Let's move on to this main language learning topic. And this is one where I can hopefully articulate myself very clearly and in a way that makes sense. But I'll be honest with you guys, this is the very first time I've ever thought about this. And this is the very first time I'm trying to even articulate this in a public format, on a podcast or video kind of format. So I want to talk about languages and thinking about languages in a vertical way and a horizontal way. I think many languages are more horizontal than they are vertical. So that sounds super weird. Let me try and explain this. Currently, I'm learning Mandarin, as you guys already know. When I've been working with people lately at my language learning events, and I've been talking with and speaking with people who are trying to learn Mandarin, one of the main reasons I find some people struggle is that they are viewing Mandarin and they're trying to tackle it purely as a horizontal language. But in my perspective, Mandarin is both a horizontal and a vertical language. This is because meaning, when you're speaking Mandarin, meaning is identified not just by the natural speech that you're doing, not just by the sounds coming out of your mouth, but the pitch of your voice. And so I almost picture pitch as a vertical element and the sounds of the language being a horizontal element. It's almost like the visual I personally have in my brain is that when I'm speaking, even right now as I'm speaking, I picture words escaping my mouth, going in a straight horizontal line directly towards the audience, directly towards the people who are listening to this podcast episode. That's what I'm picturing. It's moving, my words are moving in a horizontal line. When I speak Mandarin, on the other hand, that's not what I actually picture. I don't picture that at all. What I picture is my voice, the sounds produced by my vocal cords leaving my mouth, going in a straight vertical line. But as it's going in a straight vertical line, I picture crazy ups and downs, up and down. So if we were to visualize it, it's almost like English is a straight line if you were to draw it on a paper, while Mandarin is more of like a spiky line. Think of like when you go to a hospital and you see people's, how do you call this? And you see people's heart rate monitor, that's what you see. That's what I kind of picture it as. Does that make sense? And that's where I think people struggle with Mandarin specifically. And if we level this conversation up just a little bit, I think personally that every language has got a certain horizontal element. Maybe some languages have a vertical element. And I think languages will probably even have other, let's call it quote unquote, directional elements that do not necessarily exist in other languages. Meaning, like if I wanted to, what's a good example? Like if I wanted to emphasize something in English, if I wanted to emphasize that something was very big, right? I even just did it right there. It wasn't even intentional. If I say, oh, that table is very big, or if I say that table is very big, when I lengthen, when I increase the amount of time that I said the word very, when I said very as opposed to very, you understand that it is a bigger very. It is a bigger object than if I simply said very in a quick manner. In Mandarin, we can do that same type of emphasis. I can give that identical emphasis by increasing the pitch of my voice. I can say, like if I say 很大 and I really increase the pitch of my voice and I do that and I play with my voice like that versus 很大, right? Like versus I feel it's kind of silly, but if you're doing that you're moving your pitch upwards versus increasing the length of the word. The length of the word is identical, but the pitch, I guess the verticalness of the word, the pitch of the word is very different, and that gives it that emphasis. Does that make sense? I hope this is clear, and I hope I'm getting somewhere. But it's something we have to understand. We have to be listening to the overall feel, the overall rhythm of different languages we're learning, because if you do not have that, I guess we could say that rhythm, that overall feel, if you don't have that nailed down, the language is going to be much more difficult for you. And you're going to end up having an accent. You're not going to sound very natural. You're probably going to struggle to understand other people because you're not used to, you haven't internalized the cadence of the language. And so when people are speaking, you're not able to understand what they're saying. It's more difficult for you. I think even in some respects, there could be some issues with cultural integration for some people because you haven't integrated with that language's culture, if that makes sense. And so it's almost like you almost have to picture every language being its own entity, and it's almost like it's a completely different person. And you have to not act differently, But you almost have to be, actually, maybe that is the appropriate word, you almost have to become an actor or actress in a certain respect. It reminds me of a talk that I heard at Langfest. Langfest is a language learning conference that I attended this year in August in 2018. I actually went last year as well, but this year when I went, I heard a talk by, oh, good Lord, what is his name? I don't remember his name anymore. What is that guy in, I'm gonna Google it right now on my computer open. The guy, Hyper Polyglot movie. It's the guy in the Hyper Polyglot movie. Michael Levi Harris. There we go. That's his name. So Michael Levi Harris, he's an actor. He made a movie that's called, I believe it's called the Hyper Polyglot movie. And he gave this fascinating talk that I really, really enjoyed. And he was talking about how when you're learning different languages, you have to almost adapt and almost act in a different way to really blend into that language. And he gave a lot of demonstrations to kind of prove this point. He had a lot of interesting graphics and he had a lot of interesting visual pictures to demonstrate how certain languages sound when you're speaking those languages. And it's an element that I believe in tremendously. I think early on it's something that can be difficult to focus on. It's hard because you're focused on grammar, you're focused on remembering words. Maybe in a case like Mandarin or Japanese or whatever, you're focused on a different alphabet or different character system altogether than what you're used to in your, whatever your mother tongue is. So I do have a lot of empathy for it, and I do understand that it's not easy. Focusing on the rhythm, it's not easy at all. Not to mention, especially if you're someone who's not, let's call it passionate about language learning like I am, and maybe this is your first foreign language or you're just getting into language learning, it sounds like such an abstract concept to be thinking, oh, I'm going to focus on the rhythm of the language. Like, what does that even mean? I have a very logical brain, and even to me, as I hear those words escape my lips, my brain goes like, it snorts. I literally snort to myself like, what? What is that expression, snort in derision? Is that an expression? Anyway, I literally think to myself, what the heck kind of language are you using? Like, what flowery nonsense, hippy-dippy, fluffy-duffy nonsense is this? Like, I start having those thoughts as I say that, and it sounds so artsy, and for a logical mind, for a mathematical mind, a logical scientific mind, that is something, it's a difficult concept. It's a difficult concept to understand. The one way I will try to explain this is, let's talk about a language like English, okay? And this is a more scientific approach to it to help you understand kind of what direction I'm trying to take this in. Let's take a language like English, okay? There's a video I watched online, and they're saying the following sentence. The bosses are giving their reports, okay? The bosses are giving their reports. I believe that was a sentence. If we listen to that sentence, the bosses are giving their reports, you'll notice there are certain words that are louder and there's certain words that are not emphasized. So I'll say that again. I'll say it slowly but naturally. The bosses are giving their reports. You'll notice the emphasized sounds where the bosses were giving their reports. Those are kind of the emphasized parts of the sentence. When we look at every language will emphasize and create and emphasize different parts of sentences, and will kind of have a different, essentially, yeah, I guess that's the right way to put it. We'll emphasize different parts of the sentence, and we'll say different parts of the sentence at different speeds. I actually was in a Mandarin lecture recently, and my professor was even talking about the argument in Mandarin that Mandarin doesn't even have that type of intonation, or doesn't have word stress because of all these tones. And so if you are going into Mandarin with an English logic brain, where you're like, oh yeah, sentences have these ebb and flows. They have these words that are louder, these words that are a little quieter. Some things we say faster, some things we don't emphasize, and we just speak like that. If you're coming from that English mindset and you jump into a language like Mandarin, for you to actually learn that language up to a deep level and a high level, you're going to have to let go of that notion. You're going to have to do it because maybe Mandarin doesn't have that concept. So all in all, I guess what I'm trying to say here to wrap this podcast up, how long have we been going here? It's going for about, wow, really short, 16 minutes. I've been on fire today, really on point. Express myself with pure clarity. Wow, good, go Azren, go me. I guess really what I'm trying to say here is there's a couple main points here. I think number one, I'm trying to say that we have to look at languages in the vertical aspect, the horizontal aspect, and really we have to view it as a holistic thing, a holistic entity, if that makes sense. I think I'll be able to articulate this point much more clearly as time goes on, as I dissect this new idea that I've had in a more scientific and in a much deeper and better way, I guess we could say. And I think another thing I want to really highlight is the importance of understanding that every language has its own rhythm, and we have to adapt how we speak, how we form our words, the expression in our voice when we're trying to learn another language. That has tremendous, tremendous value. And actually, let's throw one last thing into here. We kind of touched on it, but let's actually add on, because I'm in a good mood and I feel like we can keep this podcast going and we can talk about some good stuff. I think there's an argument to be made around body language. I really do. Personally, when I'm learning languages, I expect to be interacting with native speakers. So if I'm learning Mandarin, I expect that I'm going to be speaking with many Chinese people at some point in my life. Whether it's because I'm traveling to China or I'm talking to them on language exchanges, or who the heck knows. But for me personally, and I think for the majority of people, I would assume, when you're learning a language, at some point you are expecting to speak and interact with the culture behind the language that you're learning, the target language. And as a result, language is not just a spoken thing. Language is understanding body language. So I'll give you an example. When I work with Latino people, which I often do, when I work with Latino people, often I find that I'm much more touchy. Sounds kind of weird, but I'm much more touchy. Like, I know there's I'm thinking of a specific guy that I worked with a little while back. And when I would see him, I'd be like, hey, how's it going? I almost felt like I had better posture because of how he kind of held himself and everything. I had better posture. I shook his hand. I gave him a warm smile. I'd often take my other hand and clasp his shoulder, like, hey, my friend, how are you doing? How's your day going? How's your family? And it'd be a much more, I'd almost feel more, my body language was much more open and much more expressive and much more engaged in the conversation, versus with most of my Canadian students, when they walk in a room or I see them, I might just give them a casual wave, because that's usually what we do in Canada. And there's more of that distance, if that makes sense. And I think so the body language is an incredibly important aspect. Also, now that we're really getting to this, mindset, understanding cultural mindset differences and understanding cultural norms in comparison to where you come from. I know it doesn't sound like it's part of language learning, but that bleeds into the language quite heavily, especially if you're someone like me who believes that language learning, one of the major goals of language learning is to be able to integrate with that culture and to be able to be accepted by that culture, make friends with that culture, and have that culture not view you as an outsider and view you more as an insider. And there are important things to understand around that. So even something as simple as, I think in Korea, I could be a little bit off on this. And so if I'm off, I would like to be corrected. But I believe there was, actually, let's use an example that's a little bit more familiar to me. Let's stay away from that example. Let's even use an example such as understanding in China that certain regions' food is a certain way, right? So I know, for example, Sichuan is a region in China, and their food is very spicy. Okay, this is something I know about China. This now plays into the language, because when I'm speaking with people and we start talking about that region or that food, I need to have some cultural understanding, and I need to understand that culture a little bit, or quite a bit rather, to be able to actually talk about it. I can make comments of like, oh man, last time I had Sichuan food is like, it burned my mouth off. I can say stuff like that. Or I can make jokes using that culture. I can make cultural jokes and kind of integrate into conversations in a natural way. I could say something like, oh man, I had some food the other day. You would have thought it came right out of Sichuan region. I could make a joke like that and people can chuckle at it, and everyone understands that I was talking about the spiciness of the food. And there's so many different little tiny things to understand. culturally, right? Even something like, even like understanding stereotypes. Like I live in Calgary in Canada. We have a rivalry with a city called Edmonton. Edmonton is a city that's about 3 hours away from us. We have a rivalry with it. People call it Deadmonton, like dead, like DEAD. Like it's not a very negative rivalry. It's kind of a friendly rivalry. Like we're not going to fight or anything, but it's a friendly rivalry between the two cities because we're the two kind of biggest, most major cities in our province. And it's just nice to understand that, especially if you're going to be coming to Calgary or Edmonton. It's good to know that. It helps you integrate with conversations. Weirdly, actually, it's crazy. This a crazy story for you guys. I used to work with this guy, right? And he's Canadian, or he is Canadian and was Canadian at the time. He, at the time, was doing some work. There was a point in his career where he had been doing some work in the USA. I specifically believe it would have been the Boston area, but I could be wrong on that. So he was doing some work in the USA, in America. And obviously, in America, they speak English. In Canada, we speak English. Our accent, for the most part, depending on region, obviously, is incredibly similar. Culturally, we are quite similar in some ways, a little bit different in other ways. But when you hear Canadian or American speak, often it is difficult to distinguish us. But my coworker at the time, who had done some work in the States, in the USA, he apparently, when he was there, people knew that he wasn't from there. They knew it. It was like they knew it immediately, not because of accent, not because of anything, but they knew it because of the types of references he made. Because he didn't use the language, even though his accent was the same, his perfect English, all this stuff, he didn't use the language in the identical way that people in that specific region did. Like he might say, he might make, I don't even know, I'm trying to think of an example he gave me, but he might make a reference to a hockey team, and I'm making this up. I don't know if this is exactly what happened, but to give an example, he might make a reference to some hockey team that is not that city's hockey team, for example. Or, in my city, people talk a lot about football. That's something people talk about. Maybe in the city he went to, football was not a big thing. So when my friend would talk about football, people could tell, like, why is he talking about football? That's kind of weird, right? So, ooh, I burped. Lovely. Excuse me. Anyway, all this to say that even in your mother tongue, like, it affects the integration side, and it affects how well you integrate and how you make friends and how people view you. It affects it so much to understand the culture of the region you're in, the linguistic things, even the history sometimes, right? Like understanding why and how China and Japan's rivalry works, like what happened, how did that become, and blah blah blah. Understanding, why Brazil speaks Portuguese, how did that happen? How does Brazil feel about being surrounded by a bunch of Spanish-speaking countries when they speak Portuguese? How does that make them feel? Are there jokes that happen around that? Is there any negative sentiments? Is it positive sentiments? How do the Spanish countries feel around that? Understanding that helps you navigate conversations, navigate friendships. It helps you understand what the hot buttons are of conversations that maybe you need to be more careful around, right? Like in the USA and America, from what I hear, this is something I've not had personal experience with, but from what I hear, politics is something that you are very mindful when you're speaking of. You just tread lightly around those conversations. In my own city, we tread lightly too in case you have political differences, but I could have most of the time, you could have a debate with someone politically and it might be okay. Like you'll be like, okay, and then you kind of move on with your lives. Not always. You have to tread carefully, tread lightly, be careful, all that. But again, from what I hear, stereotypically, all of that, from what I hear, it's not to the same level as when we look at our neighbors to the south, right, to the south of us. And that's something you have to be aware of, right? It's kind of an important thing. So anyway, now let's officially wrap this podcast up. I appreciate your guys' attention. We've been going for about 25 minutes. And we will talk later. Bye for now, guys. See you. All right. Language epiphany. Big language epiphany. All right. Copy. Let's save that. All right, YouTube. Well, that's the podcast. I'm gonna actually change the title of this video in a moment. Actually, not sure if I like the title of it now. Thank you for watching and listening. I appreciate your attention, and we will talk later. See you Instagram, YouTube. Bye.